everyone. So this week we are going to be looking at the Canadian Pacific Railway. So the Prime Minister at the time, John A. Macdonald, had this dream of connecting Canada, kind of the coast to coast sort of thing. He was looking kind of to the west and thought, I want to be able to have transportation that goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So in 1872, Macdonald decided to begin this project, and he asked Sir Hugh Allan to take over construction of what was going to be the Canadian Pacific Railway. Now, the issue with this is some things started to go wrong. What ended up happening is Sir Allan had given Macdonald money for the election, and in return, Macdonald would guarantee the company rights to build the railway. And word got out that this happened because that's illegal. It's basically bribery to say, hey, I'll give you money if you guarantee that only my company is going to work on this railway. It was referred to as the Pacific Scandal, and it was kind of the first sort of official scandal that Canada had. So Macdonald ended up resigning. Alexander Mackenzie was then voted in as Prime Minister. And he wasn't super keen on the railway, so it kind of was sort of in limbo. And then in 1878, Macdonald was re-elected to as Prime Minister, and he was like, all right, we're going to build this railway. Now, with building something from coast to coast, there are issues. One of the biggest things was actually building, because in places like Northern Ontario, you had to cut down hills, filling swamps, blasting through granite. In the prairies, the fact that it was hard to lay the foundation of the railway, also because it's super flat and you just kind of like had to just build for like just a very, very long time. And also some of the land on the prairie is not super dense. So it's really hard to kind of lay that foundation so that, well, the trains didn't basically slip into the ground. And one of the most dangerous parts of building the railway was in the mountain areas, because you had to blast through rock. You couldn't necessarily build straight up the sides of the mountain. And oftentimes you can actually see in the picture, they had to build these giant wooden, basically trestles to get across some of the valleys. It was really, really dangerous work. And this is kind of the work that claimed most of the workers' lives. So if there's all these issues of scandals and building problems, why build it at all? Well, one of the major reasons was the fact that, well, it transports goods and people a very far distance. Kind of before this time, you had ships for the ocean, but air travel doesn't exist at this point. And most people only could travel by carriage, and that's super slow. So if you build a railway, it's just easier. Also, it connected Canada. Connected it all the way from Ontario all the way to British Columbia. This also, at this point, British Columbia was deciding whether it was going to join Confederation, and one of the major reasons it did is Macdonald promised that there would be a railway connecting British Columbia to the rest of Canada. So who worked on the railway? Well, the workers, kind of one of the sort of terms that was used, they were called navvies, basically just workers of the railway, and it included lots and lots of different people: Americans, English, Scottish, Irish, Italian, Swedish, Chinese, Canadians. There was tons of different people that worked on this. The largest group of people that worked on this were often Chinese immigrants. Now, oftentimes these Chinese immigrants were not treated super well. They were often treated poorly and lived in pretty horrible conditions. They often faced a lot of racism and discrimination, and because they were oftentimes given the most dangerous jobs, because the way the Canadian kind of job bosses saw was that there were so many Chinese workers, a bunch of them could die, and that was fine because you just replaced them. Not a particularly great way to treat your workers. Often times the Chinese workers were also underpaid, and there's actually documents that show that most of them were paid only about half of the white workers. So you can kind of already see that this is not particularly great for them. So this was a political cartoon. Now this is a little bit after the Canadian Pacific Railway was built, but this is a really interesting political cartoon that was in a newspaper showing that Chinese immigrants oftentimes were denied access to Canada Whereas if you were a white immigrant, you had no problem getting into the country. You can see the woman; she's basically representing kind of Canada, but you'll notice on her dress she's got the British sort of flag. Now, whether that be a representation of British Columbia or the fact that Canada still had its ties to Britain, it's kind of up to you. But you can see, yeah, Canada was pretty racist back then. So this is actually a little article that came from the Chinese experience at about 1850 to 1950. This is currently at UBC, the University of British Columbia. So kind of in this, you'll notice that many of those Chinese workers earned between about $1 to $2.50 per day. Unlike their fellow white railroad workers, the Chinese also had to pay for their own food, their clothing, transportation, mail, medical care, leaving barely enough money to send home. One of the major reasons that these Chinese, it was usually Chinese men, would come to Canada is because there was the promise of going to Canada, making money so that they could send that money back home to their families. And word got around in China of this place called Gold Mountain, which was to entice these men to come to British Columbia to work. The problem is that's not necessarily what happened. And it was also important to note that many of those workers had the most dangerous jobs, and oftentimes if they were killed, many of the families did not receive compensation. So compensation is if somebody gets hurt or they die, money is usually given as a way to compensate the family to make sure that they're looked after because their family member has passed away. Yeah, oftentimes those families weren't compensated, and sometimes they weren't even told. They just knew that their family member just stopped sending letters. Also, those railway workers often lived in poor conditions, and some of them, because they couldn't afford fresh fruit and vegetables, many of them suffered scurvy, which is a disease caused by the lack of vitamin C. So just kind of some interesting sort of aspects of what it was like for these workers to work on the railway. There was also the issue of the fact that the First Nations were also impacted by this. So remember we talked about in the kind of Red River and Northwest Rebellion how people were fighting to protect their land. Unfortunately, the railway cut through many indigenous territories, and the First Nations were not particularly happy. You can see a map that kind of shows the two different sort of railways that were kind of constructed, and the fact that it just swallowed up huge chunks of land. So eventually, in November of 1885, the railway was finally completed, and there was a lovely picture of a bunch of white dudes who probably didn't work an awful lot on the railway, being like, all right, now we're done. So just some interesting points. One of them is obviously that BC at one point actually threatened to secede from Confederation, so to not be part of Canada, because there was talk that the railway might not be built. The government also at one point, because building a railway is very expensive, the government did have to aid the railway about $22 million to make sure that the railway was actually built, because very expensive. And it's estimated around 35,000 workers on the railway. A majority of them were Chinese workers, and many of those workers died as a result of working on the railway, either working with dangerous explosives, succumbing to scurvy or diseases. And the picture that we kind of have there is just to kind of acknowledge much later, this was created much later, as acknowledgement of those workers who basically gave their lives to build the Canadian Pacific Railway. So for your assignment this week, what you are going to be doing is reading a fictional historical story called The Mountain of Grief. Now, this isn't a story about an actual person, but we call this historical fiction. So what that means is this is a story that took place at that time, but the characters in it are more representations of people. They're not actual people. That's why we call it historical fiction. fiction. So this is the little preamble at the beginning of the story. I'm just going to read it. So during the second half of the 19th century, living conditions in South China were extremely harsh. The land was overcrowded and farmers were heavily taxed. It was a struggle for most farmers to survive, let alone make a decent living. In the 1850s and 60s, several uprisings took place in the Qing dynasty, and many farmers were overrun or abandoned. In the midst of this strife, farmers in South China heard of wonderful stories about the riches that were made in North America during the days of the California Gold Rush. So when railway construction in British Columbia began in the 1880s, thousands of Chinese farmers came to Canada to make their fortune. The reality they were confronted was very different from the stories that they heard, and this fictionalized account based on historical records shows. So basically, this story is kind of written almost like a journal, where it's following a young Chinese man who is leaving China to come to North America to work on the railway. So I just want you to read through the story. It's pretty short, and answer the questions. They're pretty self-explanatory. So if you guys have any questions about the assignment, please let me know.